Welcome everyone. This is a dialogue with the author hosted by the Taos Institute, and the meeting is being recorded. You have probably received that message. It will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of days, in a few days. And so feel free to share it with those you know, share the recording. And today is July 20th, 2022. And we are here with Stephen Bacon about his book, Practicing Psychotherapy in Constructed Reality, Ritual, Charisma, and Enhanced Client Outcomes. So we're very excited to be here. I'll pass it on to Stephen in just a minute. First, introduce the Taos Institute. You may be familiar with us already. So we are a nonprofit educational organization. We are all virtual, and we promote social constructionist theory and practices across disciplines, healthcare, education, organization development. And we believe that it is through the relational processes that we create meaning and shape the world that we want to live in. So we do this through conferences, courses, workshops. We have a dialogue with the authors, of course, like this one. So webinars, we publish books under Taos Publications. Many of them are free for download. You can find them on in our World Share series on our website. We also you'll find a lot of resources on our website. There are dissertations available for download. There are podcast series, videos. There really is a lot there for you to explore. And lastly, we're a volunteer-based organization. So if you're so inclined, if you enjoyed and value what we are offering, we always appreciate any donations that you would be willing to make to the town. So with that, I will pass it on to Stephen, and we're here for about an hour and a half, and we can get into a conversation about his book. So welcome, Stephen.
Well, thanks a lot, Alex. I appreciate the introduction, and welcome everybody. It's great to see folks here that are interested in talking about this material. I'll give a tiny introduction to myself. I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice in Santa Barbara, and I've been spending the last 10 or 15 years looking at how psychotherapy works and writing books and articles about it. So today's workshop, it's going to be divided into basically three parts. The first part is a brief PowerPoint presentation where I'll be sharing the starting point for this work that's embodied in my book. And then I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end of that. And then we will discuss the PowerPoint presentation, ask any questions, discuss it. Then I'll do a very brief introduction that is to set up our sort of small group work. And that part of today's meeting, the material that I'll be presenting has a different angle on constructionism. I'm going to share my PowerPoint over here now. So hold on one second. Okay. So basically, so the thing that is a bit different about what we're going to be talking about today is that constructionism is typically been derived from two sources. A lot of the original work on constructionism came out of cross-cultural anthropology, because obviously when you look at different cultures, you get a sense of what's constructed. And then most of the modern work comes out of philosophy, language, and so forth. Those approaches to constructionism have been incredibly helpful. And it's so common now that pretty much everybody has an idea of what constructionism is, social constructionism, constructed ideas, and so forth. The work that I'm going to be presented here, however, is derived from the psychotherapy outcome research. And it makes a difference where things are derived from, because when you start applying a constructionist perspective that comes out of the psychotherapy outcome research, it's particularly pertinent to the practice of psychotherapy. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to go through this brief presentation fairly rapidly, because I know there's going to be time for questions. And I think quite a few of you know some of this material anyway. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. When psychotherapy was introduced, the big question was, does it work? And that question got answered in the 70s with a bunch of meta-analyses, which showed that psychotherapy had an effect size of about 0.8, and it was equivalent to a lot of medical procedures. And the question of, is it helpful, does it work, got answered. Then, of course, the next thing is, how does it work? And our field was complicated by the fact that we had these different schools of psychotherapy. And so the people asking the question, how does it work, came up with an idea that it worked via a combination of common factors and specific factors. Common factors were factors in psychotherapy common to every approach, psychodynamic, CBT. Specific factors were the factors unique to each approach, the background theory, the specific techniques that apply to each approach, and so forth. Everybody agreed there were common factors in every approach, and the debate started going on how important were the specific factors. And this debate immediately ran into something very provocative called the dodo bird theory. The dodo bird theory is derived from those meta-analytic studies, which tend to look at a lot of outcome studies altogether. And the conclusion is that all approaches to psychotherapy work, and they all work equivalently. And so it's called dodo bird, of course, from the quote in Alice in Wonderland that you can see on the screen. Everyone is one and all must have prizes. Now, the problem with the dodo bird theory, remember we have these specific factors and we have these common factors. The dodo bird theory, because it says that every approach gets the same result, even though they use very different techniques and different theories, is it postulates that if the effects of psychotherapy are common factors plus specific factors, then the different approaches must be getting exactly the same effect size in the specific factors. That's very illogical, given how different every school is. And so the dodo bird kind of implies that either by weird coincidence, everything is exactly equal, even though you go at it very differently, or there are no specific factors and there's only common factors. Now, that is really a wretched idea for the field of psychotherapy, that there's only common factors, because that would mean that we'd say that as long as you're having a relationship with a wise and caring person, you're going to get better because you go in and chat with them and they ask you to. That's not very scientific. It's not very impressive. So naturally, there was a pretty big attack on the dodo bird conclusion. And there's two main arguments. First, and these are the medical model or specific factor people, because the medical model and specific factors are tight like this. And the reason is the medical model says psychotherapy is like treating an illness. You start with a diagnosis, then you figure out a powerful evidence-based intervention, and then you get remediation of symptoms, cure, improvement, whatever. So you have to have a powerful intervention in the medical model. That's a specific factor. It kills the medical model if it's all common factors. So they pointed out that there's a bunch of studies where one approach is better than another. And they also pointed out that they're dismantling studies. Those are statistical studies where you try to figure out what percentage of the effect size is due to male or female gender or specific techniques or the therapeutic alliance. And they said, look at these studies. We don't believe in dodo bird. Dodo bird is wrong. Really, there are quite a bit of specific factors. But the people who love the dodo bird defended the bird and said, nah, you guys are wrong. Actually, all those studies that show one is better than another, most of them either have bad design or due to allegiance factors. Allegiance means the therapists like one approach more than the other, so they're better at it. That's an allegiance factor. And so fundamentally, they said the dodo bird still rules. So this is a very nice quote from Scott Miller. Scott Miller is famous nowadays for his deliberate practice and feedback-informed treatment. But during all this, specific common factor debate, he was a major figure on the common factor side. And he fought as hard as he could for common factors, then came up with this conclusion, which is we are hopelessly stalemated. And you can read his summary. He basically said, forget about it, not worth fighting anymore. Let's move on. And the field has come to a functional or pragmatic conclusion about this that says common factors are very important, but specific factors still matter. So they respect people who offer workshops and a new approach. They believe we should develop new approaches, but pretty much everybody still thinks the therapeutic alliance is very important. This is our current state. So what you're going to hear next is a simple solution once and for all to this dilemma. And I have to tell you before we start, this solution is very common sense and doesn't really take a lot of thinking to figure it out. It's kind of a mystery why a lot of people haven't published this stuff before. As you'll see, everything is available and it's all very logical. It's a very simple idea. Specific factors means that techniques have inherent power. In other words, if I know good ways to change people, those techniques will make me more powerful than therapists who don't know those techniques. It's basically the same idea that we get in medicine. If I know a great way to cure diabetes and the other doctor doesn't know it, I'm a better doctor. I have a technique with inherent power. So obviously, if techniques have inherent power, then people that know more of them are going to be better than people who don't. And the two kinds of people who know more are experienced people. More experienced therapists know more techniques than less experienced, and they've practiced them more assiduously. Common sense. The second one is trained versus untrained. Obviously, people that are trained know techniques. People that are untrained don't know techniques. So if techniques have inherent power, then there'll be an experience effect in psychotherapy. More experienced therapists are better. And there will be a training effect. Trained people best the untrained. And that should put to rest the dodo bird stalemate. Either it's going to come out in favor of specific factors or the other way around. And most people, of course, feel it's a slam dunk because most therapists, well, I should say all therapists pretty much feel that their training and experience has made them better therapists. So this should be a slam dunk for techniques have inherent power. But of course, I wouldn't be doing this if it really came out that way. I'm doing it because surprisingly, it comes out the other way. It is very easy to measure this because we have hundreds and hundreds of studies that test outcome and also measure how many years of experience the therapist has. So obviously, the more experienced therapists should get better outcomes. When you read the screen, you realize that it says in large meta-analyses, the correlation between experience and outcomes is 0. More experience does not lead to better outcomes. That should be the end of the discussion. Because this is like, if you take a look at it, right here, this slide is summarizing over 200 studies. Experience should be a robust variable. If you get a 0 correlation in over 200 studies, you've proven that either experience has very little effect, not measurable, or 0 effect. But of course, it's such a shocking thing, they went and did a lot more studies. Because when that came out, it shook everybody up. And the best study that was done that showed experience mattered was a meta-analysis from Stein and Lambert, 95. And you can read, they found a few modest effects from experience in certain situations. That was the best response to what we just saw. But if you take a look at the second bullet point down here a little bit lower, you notice it was Stein and Lambert. And here's a review study with Lambert and Ogles. It's the same Lambert, Michael Lambert, who is retired now, but at that period, Michael Lambert was arguably the #1 expert on psychotherapy outcome, maybe in the world. He's in the top 3 anyway. He obviously changed his mind because this is 2004, and he's basically saying, sorry, no experience effect. Here's some more recent large studies since all that time that are a little bit more also finding the same thing, no experience effect. This one is really important, and this one is very shocking. So paraprofessionals are people that have no formal training in psychotherapy. Some are like recovering alcoholics, some have a bachelor's degree in something like biology. They end up working in a treatment center, halfway houses or whatever. These are large studies, meta-analyses that compare the results achieved by paraprofessionals who have virtually no training. They have 1 or 2 workshops and vastly less experience than licensed psychologists and psychotherapists. And if you read these things, you'll see that those large meta-analyses not only said that the paraprofessionals were as good, in one meta-analysis, they were better than the licensed people. So now we're putting like extra nails in the coffin of the idea. This is something I'm just including. Scott Miller, the guy I referenced earlier, he's done some studies that suggest that people gradually get worse over time, that experience doesn't make them better. And he compares it to a slow leak from an inflated balloon, which is a rather wretched way to think about ourselves, but that's his summary statement. And I looked at his studies. These are not strong effects, but they're there, and they're modest effects showing getting worse. And then finally, we have 2 studies, and only 2, that show people with no experience versus experience. The first is the famous one by Stroop and Hadley, and that compared college professors doing therapy with normal neurotics against licensed professionals. Everybody got better, and they got better equivalently. That study was replicated about 5 years ago by Anderson et al. They compared 4th-year students, graduate students in clinical psychology, with 4th-year graduate students in history and biology. And the graduate students in history and biology got improvements equivalent to what we saw with the clinical psych students. You can see that when we go to training now, that's the end of the experience part. When we go to training, there are quite a few studies that show that training does result in improvements in something, like they can do manualized treatments better, or they can do active listening better. So there's quite a lot of evidence that training can change performance. Unfortunately, there are no studies that show that training improves performance with clients. So supervision, which is an important part of training, you would think that would automatically improve outcome. Most of us really are grateful to at least some of our supervisors, feel they helped us a lot. But here's the quick review study on supervision. No effect on outcome from supervision. These are review studies, large review studies. It's their summary statements that talk about looking at all the studies on training. And you can take a look. I'll just read this one. Overall, research findings provide little support. The typical professional training leads to better outcomes. And the second one has the same conclusion. Now, I only included, this is another one of the studies that shows that paraprofessionals do as well as licensed professionals. I just put that in because of the quote at the very last part. We urge the field to squarely face the possibility that supervised novice counselors may be as effective as experienced counselors. And so here we have the conclusion. Now, pretty obviously, we cannot say for sure that there are zero effects from training and experience. What we can say for sure is there are either zero effects or the effects are so small they are clinically insignificant. And that is a very clear outcome. And it puts to rest the dodo bird debate because there are no specific factors. Now we're going to go to the second part, and then I'm going to stop and answer questions. So we've been focusing on the effect, the power of techniques. Do psychotherapy techniques have power, or are they simply rituals that are activated by beliefs, expectancies, and placebo? And obviously, our answer is they're rituals activated by placebo, expectancies, and belief. Now, everything we said about training and experience and techniques also applies to psychotherapy's privileged knowledge. So privileged knowledge, to define it, is the knowledge that is owned by a particular profession that you get trained in. So if we were going to be a chemist, we'd be trained in chemistry stuff and so forth and so on. When there's no training effect and no experience effect, it means that everything that's part of our privileged knowledge, all the diagnoses, all of the systems that underlie it, everything about client characteristics, all the speculations about dynamics, everything that's been written about the therapeutic alliance, not one of those things correlates with enhanced therapeutic outcomes. So we're not simply saying that techniques are rituals. We're also saying that everything in our privileged knowledge is unrelated. This is a pretty radical statement to make about 100 years of work by thousands of really bright and clever people. But it falls right out of this research. And after you've looked at the research, if you take it seriously, you have to take seriously that privileged knowledge is unrelated to outcomes. And what are the implications of that? Now, one little caveat, I wanted to define this. You have to be careful when you're talking about privileged knowledge. For example, most therapists would say part of our privileged knowledge is the idea that getting good sleep is good for mental health. Or all things equal, people with a good social network are healthier than people with a very minimal social network. We count this as part of our privileged knowledge, and we're pretty darn sure that those things have inherent power. But in fact, those are not part of our privileged knowledge, because when people come to graduate school, they already know all that stuff. In other words, that's part of the common knowledge of our culture. When we say that our privileged knowledge is unrelated outcome, we're talking about things like the difference between, a paranoid personality disorder and a schizotypal situation. That's privileged knowledge. That is unrelated outcome. But the idea that if you get a dog, you're likely to have less depression. That's part of common knowledge, because your sister-in-law could tell you that at lunchtime with no training. So it's very important when we say that our privileged knowledge is unrelated outcome, that we discern between what's the common knowledge part of it and what's the actual privileged knowledge part of it. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and take questions from anybody that would, I'll even get rid of this and so I can see a little bit more. Okay, questions, comments? This is a big deal. If everything else we're going to do today is based on the idea that this actually makes sense, the research is solid, and that you all are at least engaged in the idea that techniques have no inherent power and our privileged knowledge has not been helpful when it comes to outcomes. So it's time to comment or question or point out any flaws in the reasoning.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for that. This is Ray Remy here. As I was listening, I was just going back my own mind's eye, but a lot of these concepts and thoughts. And one of the things that occurred to me was the idea of defined outcomes by whom. And where I'm going, there's a recursiveness of that. And so I think about the differentiation between outcomes, doing a meta-analysis and having outcomes in accordance with certain measures that we provides, like here's a score sheet and a Likert scale, et cetera, versus idiographic interviews and saying, hey, Steve, what was that experience like for you going to see Ray versus Sally? Oh, Ray was a tyrant. Ray was, I got better, but it was just not a good experience. And there might be more qualitative, nonlinear outcomes that are not captured in the typical psychotherapeutic research paradigm. I was curious about your thoughts on that.
This is probably the single most common question about this literature. So I'm going to give you sort of the simple answer and then slightly more complex. The literature we're talking about is the literature that shows that psychotherapy works, that documents the effect size of 0.8. So we use this same literature to validate what we do and say, this is how we know people get better. And it's a pretty robust size. 0.8 is roughly translated as somebody in the treatment group is better off than 80% of the people in a waiting list control group, is the way an effect size of 0.8 is usually defined. Now, all of the measures we have range from self-report to behavioral observations, and so forth and so on. If experience is a robust factor, then it should be robust enough to show on the same research that proves that therapy works. So let's say we're measuring the outcome of depression by self-report, by behavioral observations, they're out of bed, they're doing uptime versus lying around, and so forth and so on. If experience doesn't show up on the same measures that shows that psychotherapy works, it's a very subtle, small effect. Now, idiosyncratic studies are always going to generate more data and be more nuanced. So for example, if you do individual interviews and you say, well, I like this person more because they expressed that they were strong feminists. It's not that you don't get some more data from it. And it's not that you can't get a richer sense of the experience of that therapy thing, but it doesn't actually bear on the question of whether techniques have inherent power. It bears on the question of what that person's experience was in psychotherapy. I'm sorry, I saw another question in the chat. Oop. Then how can psychotherapy claim the outcomes of improved life? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll guess at it. You're saying that if techniques have no inherent power, how does it work if our privileged knowledge isn't related and if our techniques are just rituals? Well, it works exactly like it's worked in every other culture. So for example, if we get a cross-cultural analysis of some cultures believe that mental health problems are due to spirit possession, and they identify the spirit, and then they do an exorcism, and the symptoms go down. So how did it work there? Well, we would say placebo beliefs and expectancies. So that's how it works in our culture as well. At least I think that's what your question was. It works the same in our culture as it works in every other culture. And we just don't talk about spirits like they do in certain cultures. In other cultures, they might talk about a spiritual substance like mana, and that all mental health problems are due to a deficit of mana that has to be achieved by right living and the right amount of rituals. And if you do that, you also get a remediation of symptoms. So this is about the psychotherapy literature exposing that we are like the other cultures, and we don't have a unique handle on how to work with mental health stuff. Now, obviously, if the mental health problems are due to a brain tumor, which could be removed through surgery or radiation or whatever, our culture might have an edge on certain other cultures, but we're putting that part aside and talking about the psychotherapy related stuff.
Why are, Sam Seligman from Cleveland, why are some master therapists better at outcome than others?
Well, that is actually one of the questions for when we break into small groups and so forth. But it's pretty obvious that in any field, you're going to have below average, average, and above average. And so that's not much of a surprise to anybody. We have the same distribution in psychotherapy that they have in every other field. The question we've always asked, of course, is when we identify these therapeutic wizards, we've used a common sense idea, which is we ask them, how'd you get those great outcomes? And then we write it down and we put it in a book or an article, or sometimes we interview like many of them and try to synthesize what they all say. And I think we're all aware that even though that seems to be a common sense approach, we really haven't been able to show a training effect from reading the how-to manuals from really brilliant therapists. Isn't that peculiar? In all the other fields, when you ask the really gifted people, how did you do it? You can learn a lot from their answers. It's really interesting that in psychotherapy, that has been a dead end. And that is also part of our tradition here at this point. Why the heck can't the brilliant people tell us how they did it? So the literature we've just reviewed actually says a lot about that. Because if in fact, it's not, see, most of those people will sit there and tell you about the techniques they've used. Even the brilliant people that are way better than us average therapists, and it can be demonstrated by looking at their outcomes, they're way better. They seem to be pretty clueless because most of them will sit there and write a book about the techniques they use, or somebody else will. And we've just proven that techniques aren't how they did it. So that, if you look at the title of my book, part of the subtitle is charisma, has the word charisma in it. So if we take charisma as the sum total of both the way a therapist has that common factors of wisdom and trust, caring and so forth. But charisma implies something, kind of glowing from within, a sense of really being impacted by the personhood. So I would say, when you recognize that you can't get power by studying privileged knowledge, and you can't get power by learning more techniques, where are you going to get the power to be able to glow like one of these master therapists? And that's one of the questions that we'll be looking at in the small groups. Because when you really think hard about the implications of what this research says, is we get these two people in the room. You've got the therapist and you've got the client. You know that whatever the therapist does, whether they do a CBT explanation or psychodynamic or narrative therapy, whatever explanation they use, that explanation is necessary because there has to be a sense. Jerome Frank said that therapy starts with an explanation that explains why the person has the symptoms, and then prescribes a experience or attitude or something that, if the client goes through, will remediate it. So it's an explanation plus a prescribed action or ritual, and that results in a cure. That has to happen in every therapy. But the difference, everybody's doing that. Every average therapist, even below average therapists. The difference is somehow those superior therapists have more of a glow about them. How do they get that glow? When you read about Erickson or Fairley or whomever, that you think is an excellent therapist, they don't sit there and go on and on about how they got a charismatic glow. A few will touch it a little bit, but they are as wrapped up in the medical model as most of the rest of us. They really think they get their outcomes from the techniques they've invented or are doing really well. And that's why we're hitting a dry well when we ask them what's going on.
Hello. I have a comment.
Yeah.
I am not a therapist, I'm a psychologist, but mostly doing organizational consulting. But I am not surprised by your book, what I heard, because for the last 50 years, I am observing how the field of personality is developing. It's actually going backward. And then now, how therapists can help if they know don't know that basic knowledge about people, right? Whatever you call personality. That I'm not surprised, but it's kind of depressing to hear what you're saying. But I see the reason. Why is that? I'm shocked how for the last 50 years, I see personality field going backwards.
Yeah, well, when you have the kind of research outcomes that we're having, and look, in the title of my book, there's this concept, constructed reality. Now, constructed reality implies there's also fundamental reality. That is not the way constructionism is usually understood in modern days. Modern days, because of constructionism being derived by language and philosophy, you can see that anytime language is in use, we have some elements of constructing. You know, Ken Gergen is famous for doing his example of the pitcher full of water. You know, it's not a thing, it's something we're constructing. He does a beautiful job with that. But there is another way coming out of cultural anthropology to talk about the material that is constructed and different inside each culture and the material that goes across the cultures. And so you can talk about how to set a broken bone or build a suspension bridge is going to be the same across cultures, whereas how to cure a mental health problem is obviously constructed and different. You know, the definition of femininity, obviously constructed, and so forth. It's not that the idea that there's constructed reality and natural or fundamental reality is the be all and end all, but it's a way to think about it that can be useful sometimes. The biggest reason that we have been digging dry wells is we've been operating as if psychotherapy occurs in fundamental reality. That it is something that can evolve like chemistry or physics. That when we had all those schools of therapy, there's over 300, but let's say there's 25 major schools, that when we started doing research, one school should have more of an angle on it, be more realistic, fit the world of change better than the other ones, and it should be superior. If we'd been in fundamental reality, it would have worked exactly like that. We weren't, but we keep acting like we're in fundamental reality. And that's, of course, one of the primary ideas of social constructionism is that folks mix up what's constructed with what isn't. Okay, so we have a longer question here. In narrative therapy, we separate the problem from person to enable, externalization, right. Can everybody see this one or should I read it out loud? I'll read it out loud.
Yeah.
In narrative therapy, we separate a problem from a person to enable the person to diminish or stop the relationship with the problem and become a better person. Then from what you see, there is no need to study privileged knowledge to bring it to the people and become common knowledge. Okay, we have two things in here. The first part of this about separating the problem from the person. This is one of the great ideas of narrative therapy, externalizing the problem. Narrative therapy, you know, Sneaky Poo was the famous example of externalizing the problem. And that's a wonderful therapeutic idea that other schools of therapy have done also. Because when you separate a person into, you know, externalize a problem when you're not identified, you can decrease guilt, you can decrease shame, and so forth and so on. So narrative therapy does that really well with this particular approach. Now, is that a technique? If you teach that you should externalize every problem, it is a technique, and then narrative therapy is mixed up. If you simply say here's an example of a ritual that works really well with people in our culture. Somehow or another, you ought to help them get that the them that they identify with isn't connected to the bad thing they did, so they have less guilt and shame. If you think about that, narrative therapy has done a really nice job of articulating that. But is that different than when cognitive therapy said, you have a rational mind and here's all your irrational assumptions, and you got them from the past and don't identify with them? Or when Freud said there's 3 parts to the psyche, id and superego and so forth. Ego state therapy breaks people into subpersonalities and puts the guilt and shame on different parts. What we can recognize if we think about it is most therapists do some version of this a lot of the time. In other words, it's part of common knowledge. To think that it is a technique is going to get us looking in the wrong way. But the second paragraph of this, then from what you say, there is no need to study privileged knowledge to bring it to the people and become common knowledge. I'm not sure I followed. I get the first part about externalization, and obviously I'm a big fan, and I think it's something most of us do most of the time, and it's part of common knowledge. And it's often seen as a technique, which is going to confuse folks. But I'm not sure about this second part. If the person who wrote that wants to jump in and amplify the question. Well, anyway, I think I tried.
Hello.
Okay, could you specify the techniques that you have identified in collaborative therapy and Buddhist therapy? Well, obviously collaborative therapy is straightforward in that they sit there and say a flat hierarchy is really, really central, and that one should have curiosity and invite dialogue in a relational way in virtually every therapy session. So that's clearly a technique. I mean, doing something different than that is a different technique. So, if you say collaborative therapy is just about recognizing the humanness and fundamental equality between human beings, then we're all the way back to common knowledge. But that's really clear. And obviously Buddhist therapy, they're so keen on meditation. I mean, there are a few Buddhist people that say you can get to mindfulness without meditating, but they have a million techniques in Buddhist therapy, So, and they believe the techniques are really helpful. It seems all psychotherapeutic techniques fall into the broader categories of attention or love as perceived by the clients. Are these broad categories the equalizers? Well, remember in common factors, the most common one is a definition of a wise and caring therapist. And so everybody I know pretty much believes in the therapeutic alliance is central. The question is, how do you cultivate wisdom and caring? This one talks about attention and love. I would put that under the caring part. What we've been talking about here with constructionism is something I would put under the wisdom part. Now, the Dalai Lama has a famous quote that I can never remember verbatim. He says that wisdom and compassion are like 2 wheels on a chariot or 2 wings on a bird, and that it takes both of them to fly, and that they look different, but they all get united at the end. Except, of course, as the Dalai Lama, he said it way more elegantly than I did. But the person who's written this particular one about love, you want to, of course, that is, absolutely central, and that's endorsed by everybody. But Scott Miller, you guys can gather I'm very respectful of his work. Before he started doing all this stuff with deliberate practice and feedback informed treatment, his original idea was, since it's all common factors, why don't we just start emphasizing cultivating wisdom and caring in the therapists we're training? And he had a big group of people around him. And he told me, we were talking about it, he said they tried really hard, and then the group split in half because half the group decided that they weren't actually successful at training it, and they went on to do this stuff with feedback, informed treatment, and deliberate practice. And the other half of the group is still saying that they can train wisdom and caring. I'm actually, if I'm going to paraphrase, this isn't the way Scott Miller put it, but basically, if everybody is already trying as hard as they can to be wise and caring, which I do believe therapists are already trying as hard as they can to do that, then telling them you're going to train them in that, unless you have something really novel, is likely to not have many returns because folks are already really committed to that. I think that's where Scott Miller went. He wasn't getting any measurable outcomes from it. Miller is a big research guy, and it's one of his contributions. And he just couldn't get a measured outcome for it. But if you really think about what constructionism is, constructionism, if you follow it down the road, is a way of saying, it's a way of cultivating wisdom. And if fundamentally most therapists are confused about whether we're in constructed reality or fundamental reality, then they can get wisdom about how our culture works. Like mostly wisdom about our culture works is like teenagers really use their phones a lot. And sometimes teenagers have big emotions. There's a lot of specific wisdom about how our culture works, and that's a certain kind of wisdom. Constructionism takes apart all the constructs and said what's real and what isn't real. That's a different angle on wisdom. And we're all committed to caring. Look, I don't want to get into this too much because we're getting toward an hour and I want to break into the small groups. Let's see. Okay, can you talk more about cultivating wisdom that isn't about learning techniques? You know what? That's what the thing we're going to do in small groups. So why don't I just delay that to see what the small groups come up with? And then there's a nice quote here about Bruce Wampold. Bruce Wampold says the common factors cause the changes in therapy, and the specific models and techniques are the vehicles. He also says it's important for clients to buy into the approach. If clients are not improving, then therapists need to change the approach, techniques they are using. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is going to set up the small group stuff, because I think that is actually going to show something, and we'll get into the small group part. So if you take a look at this picture of Jack with his famous quote from A Few Good Men, one of the things that we have to recognize is that these outcomes really feel wrong. It really feels like my experience has made me a better therapist. It really feels like some of my training has made me a better therapist. It really feels when I do therapy like the technique that I used helped the client change. It really feels like if I think about somebody who's worked with eating disorders for 10 years, they really ought to be better at eating disorders than somebody who hasn't. The literature says that anybody who claims that they're better at something because they've worked at it is just lying. They're not lying because they know they're lying. They're just not speaking the truth. Experience with eating disorders or adolescence doesn't make people better. Otherwise, experience would show an effect. You see how wrong that feels? Almost everybody wants, to go to a therapist who's like had 10 years of experience with their problem. Those of us who are therapists, this stuff really feels wrong. And that implies that to be able to use this material, you're going to have to start with some pretty profound deconstruction practices. You have to sit there and say, why didn't that person who's done 10 years of eating disorder get better than me, who's only had a few eating disorder cases? Why can I do better than that person? Or at least as good on average as them? It takes a lot of deconstruction to take this apart. And when you do that to your own satisfaction, you get an angle on constructionism that is different than simply a narrative therapy idea that we all write our own stories. I think the narrative therapy idea is a wonderful metaphor. I love narrative therapy. I love the externalization. I love the idea that we write our narratives and other people write our narratives, and I want to reauthor. I think Foucault is brilliant, and I love the idea that language constructs everything. But really, to practice constructionism, it's sitting here at our doorstep, because what we do with our clients every day, these findings are so offensive to the normal way we think about it that forcing ourselves to wrap our minds around it puts us in a different state of consciousness. And that's what we're going to wrestle with in the exercise. So this basically sitting there, I'm not going to take more time on this. It's basically why I think that a cross-cultural approach to social constructionism that implies that there's constructed reality and fundamental reality has a pragmatic usefulness for therapists, but we can talk about that later at the end if we want. That one's not that important. This one is what we've been talking about, that anytime we think we have something special, we just have to stop and think, but how come people get better when they do exorcisms? How come people get better when they do rituals that increase the amount of mana? And they've never talked about their childhood or their irrational beliefs or anything like that. Okay, so how many, Alex, how many people are here at this point?
We have 26 people.
So maybe we could break into, Alex can break you into 4 groups so you can each have a chance to discuss it. And I'll give you a place to start. And the place to start is with imagining you're in another culture. You're an exorcist and you're a good exorcist. And you've been able to really help people get a lot better. And what you do is what all the other exorcists do. You meet your clients, you figure out from their symptoms which bad spirit has possessed them. Then you pick the exorcism that most fits that bad spirit. You do it, and they mostly get better. So you're successful, and you have a technology. You have a set of techniques. You have a way of diagnosing them. You do an evidence-based practice, you apply it, and they get better. You meet somebody from outside the culture who convinces you that spirits are a construct, and there actually are no spirits possessing any of these people. Now you go back to practice, and you have to keep doing exorcisms, because in your culture, that's the only way people really accept getting better. So you're going to still keep doing exorcisms. People are still going to come to you talking about spirit possession. What edge do you have now that you didn't have before somebody told you that the spirits were constructs? How do you have an edge over the other exorcists who still believe the therapists are real, or the spirits are real? That's the place I would like the groups to start. What I'm really asking you to do is, if you take this material seriously and you actually say, whoa, it's all ritual, privileged knowledge isn't doing anything. How are we really changing people? We know we're changing people. How do we get more persuasive and have more charisma? If you start with the other culture and imagine it, what you do as an exorcist, then I want the group to say, after you get 1 or 2 points, how would that apply to us in therapy? And I'll give you one example just to illustrate it. So if I'm an exorcist that is awake and know that the spirits, when they come in to see me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably tell them that they're possessed by the most benign, easy to exorcise spirit. Why? Why not? It's easier to exercise an easy one to get rid of, and it's just as true as what they've been told already. And then that implies, if I'm going to map it on over to our culture, that when people come in with, most every client comes in with some level of explanation for what is going on, and most of us therapists hear their explanation and we usually replace it with what we think is a more helpful explanation. But if you're a serious constructionist, you're not limited by what you studied is the right explanation. You can replace it by whatever explanation you think is either the most benign, the easiest to solve, lines up with that person's truth the best, fits the client the best. You have a level of freedom about explanations that is parallel to the people who are aware in the exorcism culture that there are no spirits. So that's what we're going to talk about in small group. What's your edge? And go at it from every angle. In what way do you have an edge over the other therapists? Remember, what we're looking for is we would like finally to be able to train people and them actually getting better. We'd like them to have experience and benefit from experience. That's what you're trying to achieve by using this material about why they don't benefit from experience and training. So Alex, you're going to be able to divide the people into the groups?
Yes, so we have 4 groups, about 5 or 6 people. I will stay here, and a few people have to leave. I see messages coming in. And how much time would you like them to be in the conversation?
Why don't we do that for about 15 minutes?
15 minutes. Okay, here we go. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Everyone is here, and we have about 6 minutes to wrap up. So Stephen, you're muted, but you can take it from here.
That was weird. Okay. Well, typically what we should do is have each breakout room report what they thought was most important. We only have 6 minutes though. So why don't I just pick one? Why don't we just have one group that wants to share anything that happened in their room? and then we can kind of comment on that group. Doesn't much matter who it should be. Anybody willing to talk?
Jean-Luc there.
Yeah, okay. You hear me?
Hey, Jean-Luc.
Hi. Hi, Stephen. You may not be surprised that it's me. Okay, so what we talked about was well, to be very open about everything. So as a scientist, you can say, well, I have a new edge now, and as a scientist, I don't believe anymore in the spirits and the ghosts, etc. But and at the same time, and I'm very respectful to your opinion still. I'm very much interested. I believe that there is a lot of deeper meaning in the spirit world. And I'm very much open to talk about that in this way. So I follow you with my emotions, very interested, very respectful, very open also. But I have become a scientist now.
That what the group I was sitting in with came up with the same idea that if you're not burdened by a lot of expectations and a need to put people in a certain clinical box, a framework that you've studied and you think is valid, then you're capable of seeing the person as they are. You have an edge over seeing them as they are. Sounds like the group I was in and the one that you are reporting from had a similar insight. Any group have a different insight? So I'll throw out an idea that we were talking about at the end. We normally get our charisma, our respect, by studying and learning. I'm a Ph.D. psychologist, so I'm a doctor, and I've studied a lot of places. So all my access to privileged knowledge is what is supposed to give me authority. But the research says that everything I know about that is not useful. So with these new rules, how do I enhance my charisma if I can't enhance it by learning new techniques, reading books by really smart therapists? Because obviously, if my charisma is enhanced, I'm going to get better outcomes. So what alternative ways besides studying or being, any group discuss that, or anybody want to throw out an idea on charisma enhancement, being more persuasive, having more impact?
I think once you use the word charisma, and immediately I go to, how do I get more charisma? I won't be any good unless I get more charisma. And I think it's sort of, even though you can identify what these factors are, nonetheless, they also become roadblocks to your own creativity. I was just reacting to that.
That's a really interesting point. Maya's point about listening and them teaching you creates more charisma. That one makes sense. If we think about other cultures, how does a shaman get charisma?
Privileged.
Pardon?
Privileged.
They do a vision quest, or they go to the land of the dead, or they cure themselves. They have some profound, if you're a mystic in India, you go live in a cave and have these. It used to be in most cultures that the entry level was some profound personal experience. And we still have that in our own culture. It's not formalized. I don't have clients coming in saying to me, did you meditate in India and have a God realization experience? But that's what they do if you go study with a yoga teacher in India or a shaman figure. We don't actually have that idea, but that is one of the oldest ideas. Yeah, Jean-Luc's pointing out that maybe profound experiences with clients. And I think that that's a great idea. The problem I have with that is that many of us have had profound experiences, and it doesn't seem to show that more experienced people that would have more of those are better. So there must be something tricky about it. I still think it's the right answer, but we'd have to talk about it more. Well, it is 11:30 and we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank everybody who came and really appreciate you showing up and making contributions.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And thank you so much, Stephen, for hosting today and leading us through this conversation. So as I mentioned, the recording will be available and you can find it on the Taos Institute website and on our YouTube channel. So we will be sure to send you an email when that is ready. So thank you, everyone.